You're not even her real granddaughter." The words weren't shouted. They didn't explode like a slap. They were delivered in a voice so cold, so steady that for a moment I thought I'd misheard. But then my father, Victor Harper, repeated them, slower this time, laced with cruel clarity. "Only blood Harpers deserve a place in this family." I stood frozen in the center of my grandmother Rosalind's library, surrounded by mahogany shelves stacked floor to ceiling with first editions and oil paintings of stern-faced ancestors. The scent of lavender and old leather still lingered in the air, a quiet echo of the woman we'd just buried 3 days ago. Her portrait hung above the fireplace, watching. I could almost feel her eyes on me as the words landed like a blade between my ribs. Victor's shoes clicked softly against the Persian rug as he crossed the room, hands folded behind his back, as though preparing for a press conference rather than dismantling my entire identity. He stopped in front of the fireplace and looked up at Rosalind's portrait, lips curling. "Your mother's little secret. Well, it's not so secret anymore. Once the legal team confirms you've got no Harper blood, you'll get nothing from Rosalind's estate." I gripped the corner of her writing desk, the same desk where she had penned hundreds of letters and reviewed decades worth of hotel contracts. The wood was smooth beneath my fingertips, familiar and grounding. My heart was racing, but I kept my voice even. "Do you promise that?" I asked. "You're saying only blood Harpers deserve anything from this family?" Victor turned slowly, leveling his gaze at me like I was a stain he couldn't scrub out of the family crest. "Absolutely. I won't let some outsider siphon off what rightfully belongs to our legacy. My name is Camille Harper. I'm 27 years old. Until 5 minutes ago, I believed Victor was my father, cold, disapproving, distant, but my father nonetheless. Now, standing in the heart of our family's antebellum estate in Savannah, Georgia, I wasn't so sure of anything. What I wanted was simple. Justice. Not revenge, not drama. Just the fairness my grandmother Rosalind intended when she named me in her will. She'd told me so herself more than once. But now, the man whose approval I had spent my entire life chasing was trying to erase me like I never existed. And worse, he was using bloodlines as the blade. I remembered the last time I sat in this room with Rosalind. It was a late afternoon in June, just a few weeks before her heart gave out. We sat by the open window, the scent of honeysuckle drifting in from the garden. "Trust your instincts, Camille," she had said, squeezing my hand with surprising strength, especially when everything else feels wrong. At the time, I chalked it up to age. Now, I wasn't so sure. Maybe she knew. Maybe she had always known. "You can attend the will reading next week if you insist," Victor said, his tone casual, dismissive. "But don't expect a dime. I've already spoken with Richard about contesting any clause that includes you." Richard Dawes, my father's lifelong legal ally. Of course he had. I didn't respond. There was no point in arguing with a man who had already decided I was disposable. Instead, I watched him walk out of the room like he'd just checked off a task on his to-do list. The silence after he left was deafening. I sank into the red velvet chair beside the desk, the one where my grandmother used to sit while reading out loud to me on stormy nights. The house felt different now, heavier, colder, less like a home and more like a battleground. Was he telling the truth? If I wasn't Victor's daughter, then who was I? And why did he choose now, just days after Rosalind's funeral, to say it? I didn't have answers. Not yet. But one thing was already clear. If Victor Harper wanted to use bloodlines as a weapon, then he'd have to live with the consequences of what that really meant. And I wasn't backing down. I used to think my father simply didn't know how to express affection, that maybe his cold stares and sharp remarks were just his way of showing discipline, of preparing me for the real world. But now I saw them for what they were. Warnings. Subtle but constant reminders that I didn't belong. Growing up as a Harper meant living beneath the weight of legacy. Our family ran a chain of boutique historic hotels across the South, Harper Heritage. My grandmother Rosalind built the business from scratch after World War II, restoring antebellum mansions and turning them into curated experiences that sold nostalgia to the wealthy. Her face graced local magazines. Her name commanded respect. And in her eyes, I was someone worth believing in. Not so much in Victor's. He had always made space for my brothers, Spencer, the eldest, who took over the business operations straight out of college, and Noah, the golden boy with a law degree and a fiancée from the Vanderbilt line. Their paths were straight and paved in marble. Mine was dirt and roots and old paper maps. I chose a different lane, historic preservation. I wanted to restore forgotten places, protect them from the greed that stripped them of their soul. I graduated with honors. I had offers from national trusts. But to Victor, I was still just unfocused. She lacks the Harper discipline, he once told my mother when he thought I wasn't listening. Too soft, too sentimental. That girl will never lead anything. I was 14 when I heard that. I pretended I didn't, but the words branded themselves into me. And I spent the next decade trying to prove him wrong. Birthdays were polite affairs, measured minimal. My brothers got Rolexes at 16. I got antique books. Beautiful, thoughtful gifts, always from Rosalind. Never Victor. And when I brought home my first big preservation award from the Georgia Historical Society, he barely looked up from his tablet. That's nice, he said, as if I'd just baked cookies. But Rosalind had cried. She framed the article, hung it in her sunroom. She asked me to tell her every detail of the gala. She made me feel, if only for an afternoon, like my voice mattered. Our Sunday teas were sacred. Every week, without fail, I'd drive out to her estate on the edge of the Savannah River. We'd sit on the veranda, sipping Earl Grey, and she'd share stories about her travels, her regrets, the battles she'd fought against the old boys' club of Southern business. Never let them tell you you're less, she'd whisper, especially not the men in your own family. I think now, maybe she knew even back then, that I wasn't Victor's, that something about me didn't fit neatly into the frame. Maybe that's why she clung to me so fiercely. Still, I tried with Victor. I volunteered for fundraisers. I offered proposals to modernize the preservation side of Harper Heritage. I presented budgets, strategies, solutions. He never once followed up. At a family brunch last year, he introduced me to a potential investor as the one who colors inside the lines mostly. Everyone laughed, except me. I didn't say anything that day. I just folded my napkin and excused myself quietly. I drove home in silence, and I cried in the driveway like I was 15 again. And yet, despite all that, I still wanted to believe he was my father. Isn't that the cruel part? Even when someone cuts you down again and again, some part of you still hopes they'll change, that they'll see you, that they'll say, I was wrong about you. But Victor never did. And now, in the harsh light of that library, I realized he never would. Because in his eyes, I wasn't his daughter at all. And maybe I never was. What burned wasn't the loss of inheritance. It was the decades I spent chasing crumbs of approval from a man who saw me as disposable, a backup, a placeholder. I wanted to scream, to break something. But instead, I walked upstairs to the old guest room where I used to sleep during summers. I pulled open the cedar trunk at the foot of the bed and lifted out the box Rosalind had given me on my 25th birthday. It was filled with letters, dozens of them, handwritten, carefully dated. The top one read, for Camille, because I knew the day might come when truth would feel like betrayal. But it's not. It's freedom. I held the letter to my chest and sat there in the quiet, the weight of it all settling on my shoulders like a second skin. Everything was shifting. My name, my blood, my place in this family. But maybe, just maybe, that meant I was finally free to become something else. Not a Harper by Victor's definition, but someone who would redefine what that name meant. My mother's message came just after midnight. We need to talk. Alone. Tomorrow. No one else. I stared at the screen, heart pounding, knowing what it meant without needing to ask. Victor's words had ripped something open, but my mother's text confirmed it. There was truth behind the cruelty. She chose a quiet cafe tucked in a historic district, the kind of place with chipped teacups and worn wooden floors that smell like cinnamon and stories. It was where she always came when she didn't want to be recognized as Margaret Harper, the matriarch, just as a woman trying to breathe. She was already seated when I arrived, hands folded tightly around a cup of untouched coffee. Her pearl earrings were missing. Her makeup was faint. The scarf around her neck was tied just a little too tightly like armor. "I never wanted you to find out like that," she said before I even sat down. Her voice cracked, not with guilt, but exhaustion. He had no right. "So it's true?" I asked. "I'm not his daughter?" She nodded, just once, and then she started to cry. Not loudly, not dramatically. Quiet tears, the kind you cry when the dam finally breaks after years of holding the weight of too many secrets. "It's complicated," she whispered. "More complicated than Victor wants it to sound." I didn't interrupt. I didn't touch her hand. I just waited. And slowly, she peeled back the history she'd buried for almost 30 years. She and Julian, my so-called uncle, had been in love when they were barely more than kids. She was 22, working as a preservation intern under Rosalind's guidance. Julian had just finished med school, full of fire and wild ideas about changing the world. They were planning a life together, until Julian was offered a prestigious research fellowship in Seattle. "He wanted to turn it down," she said, eyes far away. "But I told him to go. I didn't want to be the reason he stayed behind." They tried the distance thing. Letters. Late-night phone calls. But time stretches thin when careers are blooming and families apply pressure. Eventually, things unraveled. During a difficult period, when Julian had stopped writing and Rosalind's health had faltered, she found herself leaning on Victor, Julian's older brother. Victor had always been there, watching, waiting, and in a moment of vulnerability, one that she now described as a terrible blur of grief and loneliness, she let him in. The relationship didn't last long, but shortly after it ended, she discovered she was pregnant. "I was certain it was Julian's," she said, voice shaking. The timeline fit. But Victor, he refused to believe that. He said it was his, and he proposed. She looked up at me then, her eyes full of sorrow and something else, something heavier. "Camille, I accepted, because I was scared, because I didn't want to raise you alone. And Victor promised, he swore he'd love you like his own." "But he didn't," I said flatly. "No," she admitted. "He never did. He resented the parts of you that reminded him of Julian, the softness, the stubbornness, the way you loved history more than money." She sipped her coffee, her hands trembling. "Julian was already engaged by the time I found out I was pregnant. And your grandmother, she knew. I think she always knew. But she never pushed me, never judged me. She just told me to protect you." I sat in silence, trying to process everything. I thought of every cold glance Victor had ever given me. Every time he'd turned his back when I'd needed him. Every time he'd said I was too soft, too artistic, not Harper enough. And now I knew why. "What about Julian?" I asked. "Did he ever know?" She shook her head. "I didn't tell him. I didn't want to disrupt his life again." And then, as the years passed, it just felt too late. I stared at the table between us, suddenly hollow. The father I thought I had wasn't mine. And the man who was, he had no idea I even existed. "Why is Victor doing this now?" I asked. "Why now, of all times?" Her expression changed, tightened, hardened. "Rosalind's will." "Of course. Victor's terrified she left you something substantial. You were her only granddaughter, her favorite, and if anyone in that family would have made sure you were taken care of, It was Rosalind. She reached into her purse and pulled out a folded piece of stationery. "I found this," she said softly, "in Rosalind's jewelry box, addressed to you." I unfolded it with careful hands. The handwriting was unmistakably hers, elegant, slanted, precise. "My darling Camille, if they try to take what's yours, don't let them. Blood is only one kind of truth, and sometimes it isn't the most important one. You are a Harper by every measure that counts." I felt something inside me shift. Not just sadness, not just rage. Resolve. The woman I loved most in this world had believed in me enough to leave a warning behind. A thread of guidance, a weapon cloaked in warmth. And if Victor wanted a war over bloodlines, then I would give him one. The drive to Charleston felt longer than usual. I took the coastal highway, windows down, letting the salt air slap against my face in hopes it might numb everything I was feeling. It didn't. The further I drove, the heavier the weight in my chest became. How do you ask a man if he's your father when he doesn't even know you might be his daughter? Julian Harper lived alone on a quiet stretch of land just outside the city, in a converted plantation house surrounded by tall pines and silence. The kind of place that made you whisper without meaning to. He'd always been the outlier, Rosalind's youngest son, the one who had walked away from the family business to become a doctor, a researcher, a wanderer. He came back for holidays sometimes, brought rare teas from Asia, books from obscure presses, little hand-carved figurines. Gifts he gave me with a quiet smile and a warm hand on my shoulder. I used to think he was just the nice uncle. Now I wondered if it had been something more instinctive. Unspoken, undetected. He answered the door in worn jeans and a linen shirt, looking exactly the same and yet entirely different. When he saw me, he smiled, until he registered my expression. "Camille," he said gently, "is everything all right?" I hesitated. "Can we talk? It's not something I want to do over the phone." He led me to the back porch. It overlooked a marsh that glittered under the mid-morning sun. He poured sweet tea into tall glasses and sat across from me, concern settling between us like dust. "What's on your mind?" I took a breath, then another. Then I said it. "Did you and my mother, were you ever together? Before she married Victor?" He didn't flinch, but the glass in his hand paused halfway to his lips. He didn't speak right away. Instead, he set the drink down carefully, folded his hands, and looked out across the marsh. "Yes," he said finally. "We were young. We were in love. And we were fools to think we could outsmart time and distance." He turned back to me, brow furrowed. "Why are you asking this now?" I pulled a folded napkin from my bag and unfolded it slowly. Inside was Rosalind's letter. I let him read it. His fingers trembled. "Victor told me I wasn't his daughter," I said, my voice steadier than I expected. "And my mother, she confirmed that. She said she was pregnant right after your last visit home." Julian's eyes darkened, not with anger, but something deeper. Regret, maybe. Or grief, with nowhere left to go. "She never told me," he whispered. "Not once. I always wondered why she drifted away so quickly. I thought maybe it was my fault. I didn't know. Camille, I didn't know." I looked at him. Really looked. Same sharp jawline. Same wide-set eyes. Same high cheekbones. It wasn't confirmation, but it was close. "I need to know," I said, "before the will is read. Before Victor finds a way to erase me from everything." He nodded without hesitation. "Then we'll find out." We drove together to a private diagnostics clinic Julian trusted, one he used for discreet medical consultations. The staff didn't ask questions. They just handed us swabs and paperwork, spoke softly, professionally. The test would take 72 hours. 3 days. 72 hours to find out who I really was. Not just in name, but in blood. We sat in his truck afterward, parked under the shade of a Spanish moss tree. Windows down, the silence thick between us. "Do you want me to be your father?" he asked suddenly. The question hit me harder than I expected. I looked down at my hands. I want to know who I am, I said. But more than that, I want Victor to stop thinking he can define me. He exhaled slowly. I've always felt connected to you, Camille. I just never understood why. If the test says what I think it will, I want to be part of your life. Not just because of biology, but because you matter. I nodded, unable to speak. Before I left, he gave me an old photograph. It was a candid shot, him and my mother in the garden at Rosalind's estate laughing. She was looking up at him like the rest of the world didn't exist. I kept it, he said softly. All these years. That night, I stared at the photo long after midnight. I saw myself in both their faces. I saw pieces of my history that no longer felt missing, just misplaced. I was born from love. That mattered more than anything Victor had ever told me. Still, love alone wouldn't protect my place in the Harper legacy. Proof would, and I was about to get it. 2 days later, I received a call from an unfamiliar number. Miss Harper, the voice on the other end asked, calm and clipped. This is Richard Dawes. I believe you know my name. Of course I did. Victor's right hand. The man who handled everything behind closed doors. Wills, deeds, contracts, threats. He wasn't just a lawyer. He was an architect of shadows. I think we should speak, he continued. Privately. Discreetly. My office, tomorrow morning. It wasn't a request. It was a command dressed in politeness. I agreed. The next day, I walked into Dawes and Associates, a law firm that looked like it had been cut from old mahogany and stitched together with silk. Quiet halls, oil portraits, brass accents, legacy in physical form. Richard's office overlooked the river, a glass wall of power and detachment. He stood when I entered, extended a dry hand, and motioned toward the leather chair opposite his desk. I assume you understand why you're here, he said, getting right to the point. I have a few guesses, I replied. He smiled without warmth. Victor is concerned. Understandably, this has been a difficult time for the family. Difficult because he told me I wasn't his daughter, or because he's trying to keep me from what my grandmother wanted me to have. He didn't blink. We're not here to debate feelings, Ms. Harper. We're here to talk about resolution. He opened a drawer and placed a cream envelope on the desk in front of me. No logo, no return address, just my name, handwritten in thick blue ink. I opened it slowly. It was a settlement, $300,000, in exchange for my complete and permanent withdrawal from any and all claims to the Harper estate, including Rosalind's personal assets, her trust, and her corporate shares. I'm not signing this, I said, barely glancing at the paperwork. You should consider it, he replied smoothly. This is a generous offer. Quiet, clean, dignified. If this matter proceeds to court, it won't be. My mouth went dry. Are you threatening me? I'm offering you a path forward, one that avoids the unpleasantness of discovery hearings, media leaks, and damage to the Harper name. Think of your mother. I leaned back in my chair, letting the silence stretch. Then I looked him in the eyes. Victor doesn't want dignity. He wants silence. And this is desperation dressed as diplomacy. He smiled faintly as if amused. We anticipated resistance, but we also anticipated complications. He slid another document across the desk. As of yesterday, we have secured DNA verification that you are not biologically related to Victor Harper. We intend to use this to contest your eligibility under the family trust. I stared at the document. It was formatted like an official lab report, signed, stamped, and completely unauthorized. You got this from me? I asked. When? He didn't answer. And then it hit me. The last family dinner. The wine glass I'd left untouched when I stepped outside to take a call. The way Victor had personally cleared the table that night. Something he had never done, not once in my life. You took my DNA without consent. Dawes tilted his head. No laws were broken. Just precautions taken. I pushed back from the table. I hope you tell the judge that, while you're explaining why a grown man decided to weaponize his daughter's dinnerware. His voice dropped an octave. Camille, be careful. There it was, the edge. This family, this legacy, it was built over decades. Rosalind Harper may have made emotional decisions in her final years, but our job is to protect the integrity of her estate. She made the clearest decision of all, I said, standing. She chose me, and if Victor wants to turn this into a war over bloodlines, I paused at the door, then maybe it's time someone reminded him who really has Harper blood. I left without signing, without looking back, but the weight of it hit me the moment I stepped outside. I stood under the blazing Savannah sun, heart pounding, hand shaking. They were scared. That much was obvious, but they were also dangerous. Victor wasn't above stealing, lying, manipulating science, and if he was willing to do this with a wine glass, what else was he capable of? That night I couldn't sleep. I kept checking my email, waiting for the results of the real DNA test, the one Julian and I had taken at the private lab. It hadn't come in yet. I paced my room. I read Rosalind's letter over and over. I even started to draft a public statement, just in case this turned into something bigger. Then, around 2:15 a.m., my phone buzzed. A message from my mother. Camille, he knows you met with Julian. He's furious. Please be careful. When Victor feels threatened, he becomes someone else. I stared at the screen, my mind racing. It wasn't fear I felt. It was clarity. Victor had drawn the first cut. Now he was about to bleed. The results arrived at 7:42 a.m., 2 days later. I was sitting at my grandmother's old writing desk, hands wrapped around a mug of untouched coffee, when an encrypted email came through. The subject line was sterile. The sender, a string of numbers and letters. But I knew exactly what it was. DNA test results confidential. My fingers trembled as I clicked it open. Scientific jargon filled the screen. Alleles, markers, comparisons. But I scanned past all of it, eyes darting down the page until I found the line that mattered. Probability of paternity. 99.997% Julian Harper is the biological father of Camille Harper. I exhaled slowly. Then again, I wasn't sure if I was breathing or unraveling. It was real. It was fact. The bloodline Victor had weaponized was no longer his shield. It was mine. I forwarded the results to Julian, then texted him. We meet tonight. Just you and me. No one else. We planned this, right? By evening, we sat together in Rosalind's private study, just like old times. Only this time the stakes were generations deep. Julian read the email twice, then looked at me across the heavy oak desk. You were never his to discard, he said. I didn't reply. I couldn't. Not yet. Instead, I pulled out the photo he'd given me days earlier, the one of him and my mother, young and beaming under the dogwoods, and slid it beside the DNA report. Let's make sure Rosalind's voice doesn't get buried, I said. We tell the whole story, every part, her letter, this result, your adoption records, everything. Julian hesitated. You're sure you want to do this? I nodded. I spent 27 years apologizing for my own existence. I'm done. He reached into his leather briefcase and pulled out a second manila folder. Inside, adoption papers notarized and filed decades ago. Proof that Victor Harper was not biologically related to Rosalind or her late husband, Edward Harper. He had been adopted at age 2 after years of infertility. It had always been a private matter, one Rosalind had never intended to use against him. But now Victor had forced her hand from beyond the grave. Julian's mouth was tight as he spoke. He used bloodlines to try and cut you out. But if that's the rule he wants to play by, he doesn't qualify either. It was poetic. It was brutal. And it was exactly what Rosalind had seen coming. Just after 9 p.m., my phone lit up. An email from Alfred Kimsey, the neutral legal executor appointed by Rosalind herself. The subject: request for formal documentation ahead of will reading. I replied immediately, attaching the files and requesting a private audience before the family gathered. I didn't want drama, I wanted clarity. Kimsey responded with a single line, "Understood. Let's speak before the reading begins." The night before the will was read, I barely slept. I kept picturing Victor's face, smug, sharp, rehearsed. I knew he would come prepared, but this time so would I. The next morning, Savannah was all autumn gold and chill, as if the trees themselves were holding their breath. The Harper estate gleamed under the early sun, its white columns standing like sentinels. Inside, the mood was tense. Victor arrived first, flanked by his attorney, Richard Dawes, both in matching navy suits and expressions of entitlement. My brothers followed, Noah looking anxious, Spencer unreadable. My mother slipped in quietly, her eyes meeting mine across the room with a flicker of something I hadn't seen in years: pride. I waited until everyone was seated before entering with Julian. Gasps. Whispered confusion. Victor's jaw clenched. He didn't say a word. Not yet. Alfred Kimsey stood at the head of the long table, hands resting lightly on a stack of sealed envelopes. His presence was calm, his gaze level. "Before we begin the reading," he said, "a matter has come to my attention regarding the qualifications of certain beneficiaries named in Rosalind Harper's will." Richard straightened. "We've already submitted evidence establishing Camille's lack of blood relation to Victor." Kimsey raised a hand. "Yes, but new documentation has also been submitted. Documentation that challenges assumptions on both sides." I glanced toward Victor. His knuckles were white against the polished table. Still, he said nothing. Kimsey opened a smaller folder and pulled out Rosalind's personal letter. "If this letter is being read," he began, "then the secret I have kept for decades has finally surfaced." And then he read it, every word. Her confession that Victor was adopted. Her acknowledgement that I was Julian's daughter. Her declaration that legacy was about more than just blood. But if it came down to blood, then only one person at this table met that standard: me. When he finished, the room was silent. Victor stood. "That's absurd," he said. "This is a forged narrative, a desperate lie." Julian rose calmly beside him. "Then you won't mind if I share the adoption records and paternity confirmation?" He laid the documents on the table one by one. Kimsey examined them carefully, then looked up. "In accordance with Rosalind Harper's express wishes and under the legal framework of the Harper Family Trust, which specifies direct bloodline inheritance, I rule that Victor Harper is ineligible for trust distribution." The blow landed like thunder. My father, no, the man I'd spent years calling father, looked around the room and found no support, no lifeline, just stunned faces and unraveling power. He sat down. Hard. For the first time in my life, he looked small, and I hadn't even said a word. Yet, for a long moment, no one moved. Victor sat stiffly in his chair, his lips parted as if he were about to speak, then clamped shut again. His hands trembled slightly against the arms of the antique mahogany chair, but his face remained composed. Barely. Richard Dawes leaned in to whisper something, but Victor didn't respond. He was staring at the envelope embossed with the Harper family crest, the one he'd assumed would confirm his dominance over Rosalind's estate. Instead, it had exposed him as the ultimate outsider. "The letter is clear," Alfred Kimsey said, his voice even but firm. "Rosalind Harper knew the truth. She accepted it, and she used her will to ensure that truth could no longer be buried." He paused. "According to the Harper Family Trust bylaws, rewritten in 1991 under Rosalind's leadership, beneficiaries of the primary estate must be direct biological descendants of the Harper bloodline." Kimsey turned toward me. "Camille Harper is, to our best and now verified knowledge, the only living biological descendant of Rosalind Harper. As such, she inherits full trustee control of the Harper Heritage Foundation, the Harper estate properties, and all remaining personal assets." A hush settled across the table. Spencer shifted uncomfortably. Noah stared at the tablecloth as if hoping it would swallow him whole. My mother wiped a tear, quickly, quietly. Julian reached out and placed a gentle hand on mine. I didn't squeeze back, not yet. I couldn't, because Victor stood and opened his mouth. This is a farce, he barked louder now. I built this family's reputation. I expanded Rosalind's empire. I held this name together while the rest of you went chasing your passions. He pointed at Julian. You disappeared for decades. You abandoned the family business, left me to hold the line. And now you waltz back in here with a lab report and some dusty old file. You held the line! I cut in, my voice steady. He turned to me, startled. You spent 27 years making me feel like a mistake, I said. You mocked my choices, dismissed my achievements, and withheld affection like it was some sacred currency. I stood up. And all this time, you weren't protecting a legacy. You were protecting a lie. Victor stared at me, eyes cold. You have no idea what it took to maintain this family's image. I do now, I replied. It took erasing people, silencing truth, claiming loyalty while secretly loathing the very person you promised to raise. His jaw tightened. I leaned forward, locking eyes with him. You weaponized bloodlines to cut me out. You said only true Harpers deserved to inherit. Then I pointed to Julian. Well, meet your replacement. Victor stepped back as if I'd struck him. Richard placed a hand on his shoulder, whispering something again. But this time, Victor shook him off. I'll contest this, he hissed. You haven't seen the last of me. No, Kimsey replied before I could. I believe we have. He opened a second envelope. Rosalind anticipated that this might happen. She left one final clause. He cleared his throat and read aloud. If at any point Victor Harper, adopted son of Edward and myself, attempts to undermine or contest the wishes laid out in this document, all remaining contingency holdings, including his personal annuity, shall be forfeited in full. Victor went pale. A long silence followed, and then he did the only thing he could do. He left. He didn't storm out. There was no dramatic scene, just the slow, quiet walk of a man who had finally run out of masks, of justifications, of leverage. Richard Dawes followed him, his shoulders hunched, his briefcase swinging just a little too fast for composure. The moment the door clicked shut behind them, it was over. I exhaled, only then realizing how long I'd been holding my breath. Noah approached first. He looked unsure of what to say, and when he opened his mouth, all that came out was, I didn't know. I know, I replied softly. I didn't either. Spencer didn't speak at all. He simply gave a single, reluctant nod, then followed Noah out of the room. My mother came next. Her face was wet with tears, but her voice was steady. I should have told you, she whispered. I should have told you years ago. I touched her hand. You were protecting me. We stood like that for a moment. No anger, just the ache of lost time. But the most profound moment came later, after the room had cleared, when it was just Julian and me, seated in Rosalind's study, the same room where this all began. He handed me a small velvet box. Inside was a ring, my grandmother's, gold, elegant, set with a deep blue sapphire, the Harper matriarch's ring, reserved only for the one who would carry the legacy forward. I think she meant for you to have this, he said. I slipped it onto my finger. It fit perfectly. We sat in silence for a while, surrounded by books, by light, by memory. She planned this, I said at last. Julian nodded. She trusted that truth would find its way through. It did, not through rage, not through revenge, but through quiet, deliberate defiance. Victor Harper had spent a lifetime convincing me I didn't belong. He never imagined that I was the only one who truly did. It wasn't the money. People think that's what matters in these stories. Wills, inheritance, property. But it wasn't that. Not really. What mattered was that I didn't shrink. Not when Victor threatened me behind closed doors. Not when he stole my DNA. Not when he tried to erase the very roots I came from. I stood. I spoke. I held the line Rosalind had quietly drawn for me decades ago. In the days that followed, there were no grand celebrations, no press releases, no champagne, just silence. Calm. Closure. Victor didn't come back. He sent one final letter through his lawyer. Cold, transactional, predictable. No epalegi. Just a statement of withdrawal and a thinly veiled warning about future entanglements. I didn't respond. Letting go of him was easier than I expected, because, in truth, he had never really been mine to lose. Julian and I began rebuilding something that had never existed before, a father-daughter relationship founded on truth instead of obligation. We met every Sunday, just like I used to do with Rosalind. Sometimes we talked about books, sometimes politics, sometimes nothing at all. But we were there, together, on purpose. As for Harper Heritage, I didn't take over the way Victor might have feared, aggressively, publicly, ruthlessly. I restored what mattered. I reinvested in the preservation projects Rosalind had started in her final years. I reopened a crumbling Harper property in Charleston as a nonprofit museum focused on Southern women's history. I created an educational grant in her name for underrepresented women in architecture and preservation. And slowly, the Harper name began to mean something again. Not just lineage, not just wealth, legacy. I still get asked sometimes, at events, at lectures, in quiet conversations, how I stayed so calm, how I fought without destroying myself. The truth? I didn't want revenge. I wanted freedom. And that's exactly what I got. Because in the end, the man who spent his life trying to make me feel like an outsider was never part of the family to begin with. And I was always hers.